Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to you all. Welcome to the workshop. My name is Barry Stoffell. I am a blacksmith and knife maker, and also a very keen deerstalker and field sports enthusiast. I live and work just outside Sneem here in sunny South Kerry, so we're deep into deer country. And I'd like to start with a big thank you to the Irish Deer Commission, and in particular to Damien Hannigan, for giving me the opportunity today to have this chat about a subject that's very close to my heart, and also a subject which takes up a large portion of my annual workload, which is working with deer antlers and deer hides. Now that's a pretty wide topic, and I've promised to stick as close as possible to 30 minutes. So we'll discuss some sort of basic techniques and things that I do quite often, and we can take it further and go into more detail when we're all online together at the end of the month when this goes out, if that's necessary. Now, my own history in this area goes back many years. I've been a deerstalker for a very long time, but it all grew out of wanting to make the very most of these fantastic beasts that we stalk. So we've seen in recent weeks some fantastic talks from the Deer Commission on butchery with Eddie, and also of course cookery with James. So we've a great bit of advice on how to make the very most of the edible parts of the deer. But of course, once the beast is butchered and your freezer's full and the stock's bubbling away, you're left with a hide, certainly, and possibly also some antlers. So we're going to pick up the story where that leaves off, and take it onwards from there. Now we'll start off by looking at antlers. Now, all of you will be very familiar with this substance, and many of you will have some experience in working with this substance. Now, obviously, the most common use of the antlers of the stag or of the buck is in the preparation of the trophies, like the ones you see behind me. Now, not every head will be sort of suitable to make into a trophy and put on the wall, and most deerstalkers, by the time they're out of a few years, will have an antler box in the workshop or the garage, which will be filled up with bits of antler that didn't make it into trophy. So it might be full of things like the kind of the skinny ones, or the single points, or the kind of funky, wonky ones, or the ones with pronounced asymmetry to them. So a lot of you will have a good bit of antler which you could start working with straight away. And I imagine, of course, that all of you will have had to pull a stag off the hill or out of the forest, and so it won't have escaped your notice that Mother Nature gave stags very, very serviceable handles with which to move them. Of course, that wasn't the function she had in mind when she designed them, but nonetheless, they do make very good handles. Now, deer antler is a terrific substance to be making handles for tools or for weapons, and of course our ancestors spotted this thousands of years ago, and deer antler has been used to make such things for millennia. It's very light, it's very strong, and it's pretty much weatherproof. So although you can do plenty of things to antler, you don't have to do anything to this to make it fairly serviceable quite quickly. It's often got quite a pronounced texture on it, and so this will give an antler handle a pretty good grip, whether it's covered in mud, blood, sweat, or occasionally tears. So it's a fantastic substance to make handles for tools or for weapons. Now, of course, every piece of antler is also entirely unique. So when you make a tool or a weapon or a stick out of an antler, you're creating something which is entirely personal to you. And of course, if you're making something which you're going to be using every day or every week or every season, as you use that over the years, it will become worn in a way that's particular to you, and just make it even more personal with every passing season. And so, you know, making something out of antlers that you've collected yourself is a terrific and a very personal way of creating a tactile and a lasting memory of that stalk and of that animal for many years to come. Now we're going to look today in a bit more detail at making first an antler handled knife like this one, and then after that we'll move on and have a bit of a look at making the classic antler top sticks, the walking stick and the thumbstick. So if we start by looking at the antler handled knife, there are two key components, of course, that you're going to have to come up with. One is the antler handle, and the other is the knife blade. Now, if you consider the knife blade first, there are two principal types of knife. One is a full tang knife, like this one, where you can see the blade is visible all the way around, and the handle is clamped onto either side of that. So that's a full tang knife, and it is a very popular type. Now, of course, what we need here is a stick tang knife. So this is a knife blade where the tang here is fashioned into a stick, and that is designed to be sat entirely within the handle. So that's what we're going to be setting into the antler to make the knife in this case. Now, unless you're a blacksmith, you'll obviously have to purchase one of these stick tang knife blades. There's a number of good online suppliers of these things, and I'll make sure that those links are circulated to you. You can pick up a stick tang knife blade for as little as a tenner for a very simple stick tang knife blade, and of course they range up to whatever you're willing to pay for sort of high-end Damascus steel, really fancy stuff. So you can please yourself really. I mean, if you're taking the trouble to make this knife yourself with a piece of your own antler, obviously you'll want to put something fairly decent on it, and I'd recommend getting the best knife blade that you can afford, but it can be done very cheaply. Apart from the blade, the other thing you'll have to pick up from the knife making supplier is a bolster. So this is the little brass washer with a slot in it that sits at the junction between the knife blade and the handle, and just forms that sort of tough junction between the two. Now you can pick up a brass bolster for €1, €1.50, and if you have some old brass lying around, just cheap brass, it's very easy with a drill and a needle file to make your own bolster, which would save you a couple of quid, but can take a little bit of time. Now when you're picking out the stick tang blade that you're going to use to put inside your antler, you have a huge number of choices. You'll need to choose the sort of size and the style of the knife blade, and you'll also have to choose whether it's made from stainless steel, and there are a range of stainless steels, or whether it's made from high carbon steel. Now, we don't have anywhere near enough time to get into the kind of complexities of that. They both have their merits. Stainless steel is very resistant to corrosion, whereas high carbon steel will rust if it's not looked after properly. Personally, I much prefer high carbon steel. I find it's easier to keep sharp, and it is sharper. But that's very much down to the individual, and you can choose yourself. When it comes to the size of the knife blade, a lot of people, when they start stalking, will have a tendency to pick up a knife which is a lot larger than they need. But again, this is all down to individual preference. Although I will say that the longer someone's been stalking, you tend to find the smaller knife they have. Although of course, if you find that you do stalk larger deer species occasionally, you'll need a larger knife for that. The knife blade we're going to be using today for this build is from Finland. This is not one of mine. This was sent to me quite recently from Purenvasi Forge in Finland, and this is an absolutely beautiful high carbon steel stick tang knife blade. So this is what we'll be using for this project today. So when it comes to select the piece of antler that you're going to use to make the knife handle out of, this is going to come down to what you prefer, but also what you have available. For many of us here in Ireland, that's going to be from a heavy beam seeker or hybrid deer. The piece of antler that I would most commonly use to make a knife handle out of is this stretch here. So it's between just above the brow tine to the end of the first fork. Now, what makes a good antler? Instinctively, when you grip the antler, you'll know if it's going to make a good knife handle or not. There's a couple of things to watch out for. Some antlers, like this one, are just a little bit too skinny, so that's a bit too thin to make to put a knife tang inside. The other thing to watch out for, which is a common problem, is that some antlers are they just have too much curve on them. So if you think you're going to have to put the straight tang of the knife blade inside here, you won't be able to get it very far into this antler. So you can curve the tang, but that's a very fiddly thing to do, and so you won't be able to set the tang very far in that. Now, for something like a gut hook or a skinning knife, it doesn't really matter if the tang only goes in an inch and a half. That's fine. It's not going to be getting much torque. But for a stalking knife, a general purpose stalking knife that might have to be kind of pushed through rib cages and get some real heavy use, you want the tang to go in as far as you can to give that knife the strength to do the job that it has to do. So I've been very lucky to have been sent the perfect seeker antler by Dermot Long via Nils Nilsson, so thanks very much, guys. And this is a fantastic example of a heavy seeker antler from Co Kerry, which is going to make a fantastic knife. So you can see that we've got a good heavy antler here. It's the best part of an inch across. So we're going to trim it here and cut it off behind the first fork there, and you can see that it's not only broad, but it's also very straight along the section that we're going to set the tang. So the tang will be able to go a good way into this. Okay, back again, and we've now trimmed off the antler that we're going to use. We've taken off the brow tine, so we don't need that. and we've also trimmed off the 2 tines above that fork, so we'll take those off, and that basically means that we're left just with the piece that we're going to be turning into the antler handle. So you can already see that this is turning into the shape of a knife handle. So the other thing that I've done here is I've drilled a hole up through the centre to take the tang of the knife blade. There's actually 2 holes here. There's a narrow hole that runs almost the whole length, and then there's a wider hole which runs about half the length to take the tapered tang of the knife blade. The other thing that's very important at this stage is to make sure that the face of the antler there is as flat as possible. And that's obviously so that when you fit the bolster and everything else onto that there aren't any gaps around here. If that's wedged or if it's wobbly, then you'll see little strips of the epoxy, which isn't a huge deal, but it's a much neater job if you make that as flat as possible. Now, you can do that with sandpaper on a very flat surface, and just a lot of patience, or if you have access to a belt sander or a disc sander with a perfectly flat face, you can just feed that carefully into the face and get a perfectly flat finish to the antler. So the other aspects to the build at the moment, I've fitted the bolster to the blade, so that's just been filed so that it fits precisely onto that blade. And then the other pieces that we have here are 3 washers. So we've got 2 washers of black G10 and 1 identical washer of brass. G10 is an epoxy reinforced glass fibre sheet, so it forms a very strong and very durable sheet material. It's used very widely in knife making. It's very tough. Comes in lots of different colours. It's perfectly planar and won't absorb water, and it's a good way of adding some small bit of decoration into things. So with a black washer either side of that brass and pushed up against the brass balsa, that'll give a nice bit of contrast to the brass with the black. The final piece of this, apart from the antler, is this, which is a puck of hardwood. This is actually Kerry oak from just down the road from here. This is a tree that came down in 2017 in Stormophilia, and this is in fact a piece of it just here. So I have a huge amount of that. I'll be using that for many years to come. But since this was a fine big old Kerry stag, I thought we'd use a fine big old Kerry oak tree to match with and make a very Kerry stalking knife. So the reason that this hardwood puck is so important is when you're marrying the irregular profile of antler with something more regular like a bolster, the top of a hazel stick for example, having a piece of hardwood that you can mould will give you a lot of flexibility to precisely fit the 2 profiles together without there being any gaps or sort of harsh angles. And so, you know, these little pucks of hardwood that's only about 12 mil thick will just give you the chance to precisely match the 2 profiles together. So if you push all this together now, you can see that we're coming very close to being able to glue all this together. So there it is, we're nearly ready to go. So we have all of the components ready and assembled, and there's a bit of a checklist to go through before you make the final step of actually mixing the epoxy and getting everything glued together. So the first thing of course is to put it all back together and just check that you haven't got any light showing, that everything's all flush and planar and sits together exactly the way that you wanted it to. The second thing, you'll notice that I've protected the blade and the top of the antler with some masking tape, some protective tape. And the reason for that is that gluing these things is quite a messy process, and really the last way that you want to personalise your knife is with a big epoxy thumbprint on the polished steel blade. So try and avoid that if possible by protecting the blade and the antler. The other thing that you must do before you go anywhere near the glue is just make sure that everything's clean. So you need to shake out any of the dust that you might have got inside the antler there and give it a blow if you've got a little can of compressed air or compressor, or just a few puffs with your eyes closed so you don't get any in your eyes. But clean that out, and at the same time give the tang of the blade a good wipe with some white spirit or some paint stripper or something which will just lift off any dirt or any oil that might have got along the tang in the process, which would stop it from gluing as effectively as you want it to. Now once you're ready to think about gluing, you have a lot of options for epoxies these days. There's literally hundreds out there. The best type of epoxy for this job is one which will go off slowly. Now you may be very impatient to get the project finished, but there's 2 reasons for using a slow setting epoxy. One is that slow setting epoxies tend to be a lot stronger and a little bit more flexible than a very quick setting epoxy. So the sort of 2-minute set epoxies are very brittle, and they're not the best job for holding a knife tang inside an antler. The second Reason for using a slow setting epoxy is that it gives you a lot more time to put this together. So it can be a bit hectic, things can go wrong. If you have an epoxy that you mix and then you have maybe half an hour to get everything ready before the work time, before it's too gummy to carry on working with, that gives you plenty of time to get it together, take it easy, and get everything the way you want it without stressing. These are some of the glues. I tend to use the G-Flex here, which is a 30-minute work time. It goes off in about 8 hours. That's a terrific glue for fixing things. Smith Industries also do a 30-minute slow cure epoxy, which is very, very good too. So the final thing that you have to know before you mix the glue and the process becomes irreversible is you have to work out how it is you're going to clamp this knife together once you've glued it. So with a slow epoxy, you're going to have to put this to one side and leave it for maybe 8 to 12 hours before the glue goes off completely, before you do anything else with it. So you need to know how you're going to hold all that together in the meantime. So there's hundreds of ways of clamping knives together. You've got these little one-hand clamps, which are very, very handy and can be used either top to bottom with a little puck of wood to protect the point of the blade, or used as a pair to push down between the bolster and the back of the handle. And you also have the option of these larger things, like these bar clamps, which can be rigged up very effectively to clamp a knife together and just leave it in one place until it's completely set. So once you've satisfied yourself that you know exactly how this is going to end, grab your epoxy, get everything ready, get everything clean, and get gluing. Okay, so we've glued this. It's had a chance to set overnight, so that's nice and solid now. That's gone off. And now the next stage is basically to sand back around the oak and around the bolster to get the final shape that you want for the knife. Now at this stage I would be inclined to leave the protective tape on the blade and on the antler, and there's a lot of ways of going about this. So a mechanical sander makes fairly short work of this. If you've a belt sander you can clamp to the vise, or you've an old disc and belt sander like this one. I have a large belt sander which you can't see over there, which is a very good way of doing it too. Of course it's totally possible to do it with strips of sandpaper, getting slightly finer. If you're going to do it by hand, clamped in a vise, I would advise that you make these, the washers and the oak that you've put on here, pre-form them a little bit before you stick them, just to give yourself a bit less work to do at this stage. If you're using a mechanical sander, just be careful, because it's very easy to go a little bit gung-ho, to slip and to gouge out bits of the antler, or to over sand things if you're using a mechanical sander. So just take it easy. And another reason to just be a bit cautious is if you put a lot of sanding pressure onto the brass bolster as you sand around that, you can actually heat up the metal quite significantly, and that will at a certain temperature will begin to denature the epoxy, and it'll start to gum up and lose some of its adhesion. So you don't want that to happen. In terms of what shape you choose here, this one will widen slightly on the top and widen slightly on the bottom towards the bolster. Now that gives you protection for your fingers, and it's quite a popular design. Of course, it's entirely possible, depending on the blade that you choose and the thickness of the antler, to just run a very neat narrowing down onto the blade. One thing that will mean though is when you make a sheath for the knife, it won't give the molded sheath much to clip onto. So you won't have anything to hold it in, and you may end up having to put a lanyard or a popper or something across the top to hold the knife in the sheath. So they're all just things to be aware of, but basically when it comes to forming the shape of this, you can do it however you wish and however feels best and most comfortable to you. Okay, nearly there. So you can see now I've sanded back this oak puck, and you can see immediately why that oak puck was so important, to marry the profile of the antler with the profile of the bolster. So I'm quite pleased with that. We've got a nice fit through the antler onto the oak, and then with a little bit of detailing onto the bolster. So we're quite pleased with that. Beautiful piece of antler, sits in the hand very, very nicely. So I'm pleased with the way that's going. Nearly finished now. The other thing I've done since we were last here, I've fitted a little brass lanyard eye there, which is just simply a piece of 6mm brass tube, which has been pushed and glued into a 6mm brass hole, and then just sanded back flush down. And that's handy because we'll be able to put a leather thong or a piece of paracord or something in there. So we've just got a few more bits and pieces to do, and that'll be done. Important at this stage now, the oak is finished, and it's finished to the grit that you wanted, is to oil that now to protect that. The oil I tend to use most on oak would be Danish oil. So that would just be 3-4 coats of that, leave it to dry overnight in between coats, and that will form a very hard, tough and waterproof seal to the oak there, so they'll keep that looking the same and doing its job for many years to come. Okay, so completely finished now. Cleaned off the protective tape, polished and sharpened the blade. I've given the oak half a dozen coats of Danish oil now and let that go off in between, so that's all completely protected, completely waterproof. So the final thing to do with the knife before it goes out is to hone the blade. So I've got these two-sided paddle strops, so one side would be a rough leather with a bit of green compound on, the other side is a smooth leather. So I've already honed this pretty well, so we'll just give it a few passes on the smooth side just to put the final hone on that edge. And then the famous paper test. Perfect. So that knife's ready to go. The final thing to do would be to form the sheath, which I've done. So I won't go into the detail, but they're all formed from a single piece of very thick vegetable tanned leather. So that's glued, that's cut to fit the knife, it's glued, then it's soaked and moulded to fit that individual knife perfectly. Once that's done, baked to go off hard, and then that's hand stitched all the way down. And you'll end up with a nice hard leather-proof full leather sheath like this one. So the edges are finished with beeswax, which is heated in, so that finishes off the edge perfectly, and then it gets half a dozen coats of lanolin on the leather, just as you would put on a good set of hiking boots, just to fully waterproof that leather and keep it in good condition. And so what you'll end up with is a leather sheath which fits the knife perfectly. Okay, so that's completely individual to that, and that's going to go a good long while. So there she is, she's ready for the season. Right, so you've made your knife. Now we're going to touch very briefly on antler top sticks. Now this won't take very long. It's something which many of the principles are the same, and this is also something which many of you will have had a go at before. Lots of you will have antler top sticks, and many of you will have had a go at making antler top sticks yourself. So I'd say 90% of the sticks that I make would be one of two types. That either be the classic thumb stick, where you've got a fork, which is either used for setting the thumb in, or with a broader and a wider fork, they can be made into very serviceable shooting sticks by insetting a bit of rubber on the inside to stop the forend of the rifle slipping forwards or backwards. So those are very popular, and it's very obvious which part of an antler you would use to make one of those. The other type of stick that gets made a lot is the sort of walking stick type, where you've got a kind of flattened handle on the top there, and that's obviously the coronet, so that's where it's come off the deer. The best piece of an antler for making these, we've got one of our larger deer species antlers here. The best piece of antler for making one of those sticks is normally the inverted brow tine. So you'd clean off the top where that's attached to the skull, and just snip this here, and you would use this part here. So that's what we're going to have a look at today, and we're just going to quickly knock up one of these walking stick type antler sticks. Okay, so an antler stick has obviously two parts, the antler and the stick. So once you've chosen how you want the top to be, the stick is obviously a very crucial part of the build. So I would almost exclusively use hazel for the sticks which I make. You don't have to use hazel. It's perfectly possible to use ash, blackthorn, chestnut, anything which grows more or less straight can be used. The reason I use hazel is that it's plentiful, it's strong, it's light, it's very easy to work with. It's not that hard to find a more or less straight hazel switch in County Kerry anyway, so it's a very good place to start. I was always told the best time to collect sticks is when you saw one you like the look of. Now that's very true, but if you wanted to be more picky, the best time to cut sticks for stick making is in the winter time. Before the sap has risen, the wood will be ever so slightly drier, and that means that when it dries out, when you season it, you won't lose so much volume, and you're far less likely to get crinkling or lose any of the bark. So if you cut them in the winter time, season them for about a year, and then by the time they've seasoned through the warmer months, they'll be ready to work on. Now, starting off with a dead straight stick is obviously the best place to go if you can. Dead straight sticks in nature are actually rarer than you think, and you certainly don't realise that until you actually go out and start looking for one. You quite often walk up to a hazel thicket and you can see half a dozen that you think are perfectly straight, but on closer inspection they do show themselves to have little dog legs like that, or little twists on them like that. Now that's not a problem. If you can find a dead straight one, that's perfect. If you can't, you can correct them yourself, so you can improve on nature's design in that respect. You can't correct a dog leg like that, so if that's on the stick, you'll keep that or you'll use a different one. You can take out bends in hazel in particular, and you can do that by using a rig like this, and you do it by using heat. So where you have a twist, like this one's got on it there, so if you put, reverse it like that, put it in the rig, okay, so this is the bit here where the bend is, then the old boys used to do this with steam, in a big steam tube, and then they'd re-bend them over their knees to take out the bends. Easier way is to use Aldi's finest paint stripper gun, put it on the low setting, and then you just warm around 3 or 4 inches either side of the bit you want to bend. Now you can be fairly, you can get that fairly hot, and it needs to be fairly hot to become pliable, but once you've warmed that fairly comprehensively, you can put it in your jig, and then you can give it a fairly good bend in the other direction. And you'll find that with a bit of practice, it's very quick to straighten out bent sticks. Okay, so we have our straight piece, or straightened piece of hazel. We have our piece of antler trimmed the brow tine of a large deer there. And now we have to turn our attention to how to fix these two together. Now there's a few ways of doing it. Back in the day, it would have been popular to have whittled down the first 1.5 to 2 inches of the hazel to make a dowel, and then put an equal sized hole in the antler, and then just wedge them together, which is perfect. It's a bit of a skill, to be honest, it doesn't make a very strong join, and the reason is because the antler is only held on then by a fairly small thickness of softwood. So an alternative way of doing that, and the way that I would tend to do it, is by drilling a small hole in the top of the antler and a corresponding hole in the top of the stick, and then by using a length of this, which is 8mm threaded steel bar, which you'll be able to pick up at any hardware shop. The holes in the stick and in the antler would have to be 8mm as well, of course, and that's reasonably easily done with a hand drill once the stick or the antler is clamped very, very carefully, and you must drill them as close to straight as possible. So you want to drill that straight down the stick and as straight as possible through the antler. The other benefit of using a piece of studded bar, which will slot into the stick like that, is that it gives you the opportunity to add a bit of detail. So in this case we've got some brass and some G10 in exactly the same way as we did with the knife. You can easily add other bits and pieces. This one's got a bit of open, it's also got some black and white G10 just to give it a bit of contrast. And the puck of hardwood, which is another piece of kerry oak, sits there, and then when you've the antler on top, that just gives you something which will allow you to very easily match the shape of the antler, the profile of the antler, with the profile of the stick. So we'll get all that ready to glue up, and we'll take that on to the next step. Okay, so we have everything ready. We've got the antler and the stick protected with a bit of masking tape. One thing I would say is that do use a masking tape or a decorator's tape or something to put around the stick. If you use something very, very sticky, like a sellotape or a duct tape or something, when you peel it off, it may well pull some of the bark with it. And of course, on a lot of these hazel sticks, this sort of beautiful mottling is kind of part of the attraction of the stick. So you want to keep all that bark on if you can. The other thing is now you must just check for the sort of fit of everything. It may well be that things are ever so slightly wedged, and so it's perfectly parallel in one orientation, but if it twists slightly, it comes out of true. And so if that's the case, it might be worth just putting a small pencil mark through, just so that when you line it up, you know that you've gone back to where it's perfect. When it comes to gluing, there's probably one main difference between this and gluing one of the knives that we saw earlier, and that is that it's perfectly okay and probably easier to use a quick setting epoxy. We've got some 5 or 10 minute stuff that just comes in one of these squeezy tubes. Now, 2 reasons for that. It doesn't have to be as strong as one of the slow setting sort of 24-hour epoxies that you'd use on a knife. I know this isn't going to be getting as much torque as a knife, but the main thing is that these are actually very tricky to clamp. Obviously you can if you have the sort of right setup for it, but with what most people have in their garage, you're going to find it very hard to clamp this stick, and certainly the thumbsticks are no different. And so if you have a 5 minute or a quick setting epoxy, provided that it's not too complex through here and you haven't, you know, dozens and dozens of sheets to fit in, you can literally squirt the glue on either side, bit on the bar, put it together, and then just hold it tight for 5 or 10 minutes while it goes off. You can use that time to listen to the radio, think about the shopping list, think about the next season, but either way, in 10 minutes time, it's clamped, it's held, and you can just put it to one side, leave it be to totally cure, and you know that that's worked perfectly. So we'll glue this one together, and then we'll come back and we'll just talk very briefly about the finishing of the stick and the last bits and pieces that you need to do. Okay, so we've done that. We've filed and sanded rather this back, first on the belt sander and then finished off with strips of sandpaper. So we finished off that oak and the washers to about a 400 grit here. So you can see we've ended up with this oak collar, which forms a nice transition, smooth transition from the antler through down to the stick. And we've done the same with the thumbstick. So you just see that oak forms a nice smooth transition and makes a little collar that also helps to reinforce that joint as well. So with the thumbstick, I've trimmed the point off, as you've seen. I'll often do that with thumbsticks if it's a bit long. And typically the way I would finish off that fork is just with another little puck of hardwood, a bit of oak in this case as well, just to match the other. And that's just glued in place and held with a little brass pin that's pushed down inside the antler there. So that tends to be how I finish thumbsticks. That's how I'll finish that one as well. So those are doing pretty well. They just need to, we'll oil the oak with some Danish oil like we did with the knife, just to make that weatherproof. And then once that's done, the top of the stick is effectively finished, and then we'll turn it over, fit the tip, and then finish the stick completely. Okay, so we're ready to finish the stick off now. So I've oiled the oak at the top there, and you can just see that that oil starts to really bring out the grain in the oak. So that's a nice finish there. So the top of the stick's completely finished. Now we'll turn it over and have a look at how to finish the bottom. Once you've cut the stick to the length that you want, and that's entirely personal to you and what the stick dictated by what the stick's going to be used for, you'll need to finish the bottom to protect the end of the hazel. So what I tend to use is a little piece of metal tubing. You can use any metal tubing, works fine really. Copper tubing works fine, although that'll kind of green up, but you know, that's a nice look as well. This is actually a piece of a nickel silver curtain rod, which works absolutely fine. And then you'll need to just sand back the end of the stick there to the same length as that, and then put a bit of epoxy on and get as tight a fit as you can and glue that on. Now if you're worried at all about that shaking itself off, you can just run a little pin, you can run a nail, a steel pin or a little brass pin like that through the bottom, and that's not going anywhere. That'll stay there and protect the tip of the stick for a long while. So the stick's then effectively finished, apart from deciding how you want to protect the shank of the stick. And you've a couple of options. Varnish is historically quite popular. It brings out the colour of the bark very nicely. I don't use varnish. The reason I don't use varnish is because it's quite stiff, and over years varnish will chip, often towards the tip of the stick. Varnish will chip and flake off, and that'll let a bit more water underneath that, and that tends to result in losing some bark along the bottom of the stick. I prefer to use oil. I'll use Danish oil, the same as I would for the oak. And so I'll give the whole stick a good coat of oil with a rag, let that dry, maybe do 3 or 4 more coats of oil on that stick, and then that'll dry hard and protect that stick for many years to come. Okay, so we've now hopefully made very good use of the antlers of the animal, and so we're going to talk very briefly, we haven't much time left, but we'll talk very briefly about tanning and turning the skin of the deer into something useful, whether that's going to be a wall hanging or a rug, or even leather if you decide to go those few steps further. Now there's a few different ways of tanning. A lot of you will have heard of vegetable tanning, veg tan, which is using a plant-based tannin, so it's like something from oak bark, for example, to tan the hide of the animal. That's been around a very long time. It's quite a laborious process, and it's not really very appropriate for doing yourself at home. There's another type of, an even older type of tanning, which involves using the brains of the animal, which does work. It's utterly repulsive and involves having tubs of hides soaking in mushed up brains in your workshop. So it's a bit hit and miss. It doesn't give a very good result. It does work, but I wouldn't recommend doing that at home unless you've got a very strong stomach. And that brings us to the tanning method that gives us maybe 90% of the leather that you'd see around you today, which is chrome tan. Now chrome tan is an entirely chemical process. It was invented in the mid-19th century and became very industrialized in the First World War as a way of quickly producing waterproof leather for use in the trenches, which didn't rot. So it very quickly became the most popular way of making leather, and it's the easiest way to make to tan hides of your own at home. So there's a number of companies which produce kind of home chrome tan kits. The one I use, I do a good number of hides each year, and the one I use almost exclusively is K-Tan, which is a brush-on kit that comes from a taxidermy company in North Wales called Snowdonia Suppliers, I think. I'll make sure I get the link up for you guys. And this is simply, comes with very, very good instructions. It's simply a set of chemicals which are color coded, and the instructions are very explicit. You mix those up according to the instructions, and you'll brush them on at predetermined intervals onto the hide, and the chemicals will gradually do their work, and you will end up with a deerskin rug such as this. Now, there's one other way there's one other chrome tan kit that you can get from them, which I also use, which is called white tan. Now this is just a bath version of the previous one, so it's a single chemical. You mix that into a big tub, and then you'll soak the hide in that for a few days until that's penetrated into the hide. Now, that's really more appropriate for smaller animal hides like goats, or if you want to make rabbit or hare skins for training dummies for gun dogs. Because for a large deer or let's say a seeker stag with a thicker skin, that chemical won't penetrate all the way through in the time that you need it to, so that won't give you as good a result. So for most deer skins, and certainly for most stag skin rugs, you're better off getting the brush on K-Tan kit. Now, the kits themselves are almost foolproof. They'll do exactly what they say they do. The key to having a successful result from your tanning is in how you prepare the skin before, and then what you do with the skin after it's tanned. So we'll just quickly dash through those bits, because those are really the most important things in getting a good result from your home tanning. Okay, so the first step of preparing deer skin for tanning is obviously to get the deer skin off the deer. Okay, and the best time to do this is when the deer is warm, if you can get it that soon. It's a lot easier to take the skin off when it's warm, and yet there's a lot less risk of damaging the skin. Don't sharpen your skinning knife too much. If your skinning knife's razor sharp, you will put a lot of scores in the skin, or you run the risk of putting some more holes in it. Now, of course, unless you scared it to death or ran it over, there'll be at least one small hole in the skin somewhere, but don't put any extra ones in if you can help it. At this stage, it's better to leave the fats and the membrane and flesh and bits and pieces on the skin, rather than being too kind of fastidious and risking damaging the skin, because we're going to strip all that off at some point soon anyway. So don't be too picky, just get the skin off as completely as you can. Now, once you've taken the skin off, give it a good wash in cold water, lots of cold water, to get all the mud and the blood and the bits of twig and leaf and all that crap, get all that off the skin. Put it down, hair side downwards on a flat surface, ideally on a piece of board, and give a good layer of fine table salt to the top of that skin. So the salt that I would use, if this is just table salt, I buy it in 25 kilo bags from the salmon smokery in Kersaleen actually, but any fine table salt from a supermarket will do. Spread that all the way over. Now that's the first stage in preserving that skin. So what that will do, it'll keep the flies off if the weather's warm, but it will also kind of firm up the fats and the flesh and stuff and make that easier to strip off. Now we'll leave that on salt for 2 or 3 days, longer if it's a big skin, and it's best if you just tilt that surface slightly so that any fluid that comes off that skin will drain off that skin. Okay, and then once that's sat on salt for a few days, it's ready for us to do the next part. The next step is now to strip off all of the membrane and all of the fat and all of the flesh off that skin. So this is called the fleshing of the skin, and is by far and away the most important step to get a good result. So you can kind of half-ass other parts of it, but if you don't do this properly and you don't get all that membrane and stuff off and the skin completely clean, the chemicals won't be able to tan the hide properly. If you leave little bits of membrane left on there, or this is done incompletely, you won't get the result that you want. So after a few days, your skin's going to look a bit like this. So this is a salted seeker hind. So now, in order to scrape all that stuff off there, you're going to need 2 things. You need a fleshing beam, and you can use a whole variety of things for this. This is just a 2x6 that has been rounded at the top and rounded in profile there as well, and we'll just drape the skin over that and work down that. Now, you can use a piece of polypipe, you can use a fence post as long as you've smoothed the sort of knobbles off it. Piece of 6x3, just sand it around, as long as it doesn't have any sharp corners, because when you push down on your knife, those will push through the skin and you'll end up with holes in it. So you need some sort of beam, and you need some sort of knife. Now, you can use almost any type of knife that you like. The larger the knife, the quicker it'll be, and it will be a lot easier if you have something with 2 handles. So this is a fleshing knife, and we're just going to work this down the beam push off all the membrane and the fat. You could use an old draw knife if you had a woodworking draw knife. For what it's worth, fleshing a hide is much easier with one of these things. The guys that sell the tanning kits sell these, there's not much to them, but they sell them for about 15 quid, and I think if you buy them with a kit, they're even cheaper. So if you're picking up all the kit to do it and you think you might be doing more than a couple, it probably is worth investing in a fleshing knife. They're not very expensive and they do make the job far easier. Okay, now for the really glamorous bit, the fleshing of the skin. So I've hung the skin over the beam, and the skin's also been just washed in cold water again to get the bulk of the salt off. Okay, so you can see now the skin's on the beam there, and I'm going to prop it up so that the beam's pushing into a concrete block down there to stop it moving, and it's just propped in just here. Okay, so I'll take my fleshing knife and I can just start. No, that's hard to see because of the light, but you just started, and once you get started and you get under the membrane here, it becomes a lot easier, and that will now kind of slide off with the knife a bit better. Okay, so you can see I'm now pushing the membrane down and down and down, and we'll basically go all the way along the beam and strip off this, move the skin along a bit and go again. And you can see when the skin is cleaned, it's completely clean. It's kind of a very pale grey to a slightly pale blue colour, and you can see that all of that membrane is off. Okay, so we've removed everything that we don't want. So there's nothing now on that patch of skin, there's nothing stopping the tanning chemicals from actually getting at the skin. Okay, so we're now going to assume that you've fleshed that hide completely, you've stripped off all of the membrane and the fat and the flesh, and you've mixed up your chemicals, and you followed the steps of that K-tan, chrome tan process. So we don't have time to go through all the different steps of that, but as I say, there are very explicit instructions in there, and the tanning part of those kits is actually almost completely foolproof. So if you've done that, you've followed it, you've hung it up to dry, and what you are left with is now a very crispy deer skin. So there's one process left which converts this kind of crispy skin into the sort of soft leather finish that you want for your rug or your wall hanging, and that is simply a physical breaking of the hide. Now all that involves is breaking down the fibres that are holding that skin stiffly together. So the easiest way to do it, well, there's no easy way to do it, but the simplest way to do it is to roll this out over a surface, hang a bit over the edge, put one knee on it, and then on the loose edge just work maybe a wooden spatula or a fish slice or something over every square inch of that hide until you've broken down the fibres that are holding it stiffly. There are lots of other ways. Anything that physically breaks down that skin will work. So you can rig up a wooden edge in your workshop and just pull it over a beam or something with one or two people. Anything that breaks that hide down will soften it. And you'll find it changes colour from a sort of pale greeny blue, which is due to the chemicals of the tan, to a kind of very pale blue or white colour. And once you've done that, there's only a couple of things left to do. You'll trim off any of the crispy bits or the sort of daggy bits around the edge to get the shape that you want. And then the final finish is getting a wooden block and a very coarse piece of sandpaper, maybe a 60 or an 80 grit, and just sanding back to get rid of all the little bobbly bits and the hangy bits. And it's that final sanding that will give you the sort of soft leather finish that you want on your rug or your wall hanging. And that's it. So you'll be left with a chrome tan deer hide. Chrome tan won't rot, so you can use it outside. It can get damp and dry off again. It'll be fine. They make terrific bum warmers for outdoor seats and benches. Great seat covers for the Jeep. We even have a couple of dog beds made from tanned deer hides, which the guys the guys love, obviously. But there it is. So that's the end of the working with deer hides and antlers, and I hope that everyone's maybe seen something interesting, and maybe hopefully a few people will have seen something that they fancy having a go at over the next couple of seasons. So thanks very much.